Hi, welcome to Math Antics. In our last video, we learned how to add and subtract integers. In this video, we're going to learn how to multiply and divide integers. The good news is that multiplying and dividing integers is easier than adding and subtracting them. Because even though it involves both positive and negative numbers, the multiplication and division still works basically the same way. As we learned in our video about negative numbers, the negative numbers are like a mirror image of the positive numbers on the number line. Each number on the positive side has a negative counterpart on the negative side. There's a 2 on the positive side, and there's a negative 2 on the negative side. There's a 5 on the positive side, and there's a negative 5 on the negative side, and so on. Realizing that can help us understand that negative numbers are just like positive numbers, but they have a negative factor built into them. For example, think about the number 3 for a minute. Do you remember when we learned about factors? We learned that 1 is always a factor of any number. And that's because multiplying by 1 doesn't change a number. 3 and 1 times 3 are the same value. So if you have the number 3, you can factor out a 1 and you have 1 times 3. On the other hand, what if you have negative 3 instead? We could still factor out a 1 from it and nothing would change. You'd have 1 times negative 3. But because the number's negative, we could also factor out a negative 1. Doing that would give us negative 1 times 3. So one way to think about negative numbers is to imagine that they're just like positive numbers, but they always have a factor of negative 1 built into them. That means if you want to change a positive number into a negative number, all you have to do is multiply it by a factor of negative 1. 5 times negative 1 is negative 5. 7 times negative 1 is negative 7. 10 times negative 1 is negative 10, and so on. And one way to visualize this is to see that multiplying by a factor of negative 1 just switches a number from the positive side of the number line to the negative side. But that raises an interesting question. What happens if you multiply a number that's already on the negative side by a factor of negative 1? Like negative 1 times negative 3. Is that going to make it extra negative? Nope. In fact, it's going to do just the opposite. Multiplying a negative number by another negative factor is actually going to switch the answer back to the positive side of the number line. Multiplying by negative 1 acts like a switch no matter which side of the number line you start on. If you start with a positive, then multiplying by negative 1 switches it to negative. But if you start with a negative, multiplying by negative 1 switches it back to positive. And you can keep switching back and forth between the positive and negative side of the number line by multiplying by another negative 1 as many times as you want.
Positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative.
So, multiplying by 1 negative gives us a negative. Multiplying by 2 negatives gives us a positive. Multiplying by 3 negatives gives us a negative. Multiplying by 4 negatives gives us a positive. Multiplying by 5 negatives gives us a negative. Multiplying by 6 negatives gives us a positive, and so on. Do you see the pattern? In a multiplication problem, if you have an even number of negative factors, they'll form pairs that will balance each other out and will give you a positive answer. That's because the pair negative 1 times negative 1 just equals 1, which has no effect on the answer. But if you have an odd number of negative factors that are being multiplied together, after you balance out all the pairs, there will always be one negative factor left over that will give you a negative answer. In a minute, we'll see some examples of how knowing this will help us when multiplying and dividing lots of integers. But first, let's look at the simple problem 3 times 5. We know that the answer is 15, but now, thanks to negative numbers, we know that there's 3 more variations of this problem that we need to learn how to do. This might seem a little complicated, but it's really not. That's because we're going to get the same number for the answer for all 4 problems. It's just that the sign of the answer, whether it's positive or negative, will be different depending on how many negative factors we're multiplying. Basically, when doing integer multiplication and division, you can just pretend that the negatives aren't there while you multiply or divide. And then, you count up how many negative factors you have to figure out the sign of the answer. If there's an even number of negative factors, the answer will be positive. But if there's an odd number of negative factors, then the answer will be negative. So In the first problem, we don't have any negative factors, so our answer is just going to be positive 15, which we already knew. In the second problem, we have only one negative factor being multiplied, which means our answer will be negative 15. In the third problem, we also have just one negative factor, which means that our answer will also be negative 15. And in the fourth problem, we have two negative factors being multiplied. That's an even number of negative factors, so they'll balance each other out, they'll switch and switch back, and they'll give us an answer of positive 15. That's pretty easy, right? And the really great news is that because multiplication and division are so closely related, they're inverse operations, the rules about negative factors are exactly the same for division problems. For example, if you have the problem 8 divided by 2, shown here in fraction form, the answer is positive 4. But if you have 8 divided by negative 2, then there's one negative, so the answer is negative 4. Likewise, if you have negative 8 divided by 2, then there's still just one negative, so the answer will also be negative 4. But if both of the numbers you're dividing are negative, negative 8 divided by negative 2, then there's two negatives in the division problem, so the answer will be positive 4. And one way to see that a negative divided by a negative gives you a positive is to realize that if you factor out the negative 1 on the top and you factor out the negative 1 on the bottom, then you have a pair of common factors that you can cancel, just like you would if you were simplifying a fraction. Okay, are you ready for some more complicated examples? In these problems, we're going to be combining both multiplication and division. And the good news is that it doesn't matter whether a negative factor is being multiplied or divided. You still get to count it when figuring out if you have an even or an odd number of factors. How about this one? Negative 3 times 8 over negative 2. Well, on the top, negative 3 times 8 is going to give us negative 24. Since 3 times 8 is 24, and there's only one negative factor. And then, negative 24 divided by negative 2 is going to be positive 12. Since 24 divided by 2 is 12, and we have two negatives, which means our answer will be positive. Here's another good example. Negative 1 times negative 8 times negative 6 over the quantity negative 3 times negative 4. All 5 of the numbers are negative, and since that's an odd number of negative factors, we know that the answer is going to be negative. Watch and see. On the top, negative 1 times negative 8 is positive 8. Positive 8 times negative 6 is negative 48. And on the bottom, we have negative 3 times negative 4, which is positive 12. And then as the final step, negative 48 divided by 12 is negative 4. So it worked. Our final answer is negative because we had an odd number of negative factors. But what if we made one slight change to that same problem? What if we made one of the numbers on top positive instead of negative? Then we'd only have 4 negative numbers, which is even. So the answer should be positive 4. Let's see if it is. On the top, negative 1 times positive 8 is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 6 is positive 48. And on the bottom, we have negative 3 times negative 4, which is positive 12. And then as the final step, 48 divided by 12 is positive 4, just as I suspected. So do you see what I mean? All the multiplication and division works the same. It's just that you have to figure out whether the answer is going to be positive or negative. And to do that, all you have to do is figure out if you have an even or an odd number of negative factors in the multiplication or division. If there's an odd number of negative factors, then the answer will be negative. And if there's an even number of negative factors, the answer will be positive. And remember, this process only works for integer multiplication and division. If you have a problem that also contains integer addition and subtraction, you need to do those operations using the rules we learned in the last video. As always, the way to get good at math is to practice. So be sure to work some integer multiplication and division problems to make sure you've got it. Thanks for watching Math Antics, and I'll see you next time. Learn more at mathantics.com.